joined us today for our monthly Hill briefing on the subject of is foreign aid worth the cost. Of course, this is a particularly timely conversation given what I'm sure many of you have been consumed with in recent weeks with the budget process. As you may have read in the FPI analysis that you received on the way in, we believe that America's international affairs budget is a crucial part not only of ensuring our national security, but also of promoting our international interests. However, given recent and very valid concern over cutting the budget, given America's fiscal situation, foreign aid has emerged as an easy and quite a popular target of these cuts. Given foreign aid being such a relatively small proportion of our overall budget, we believe that the solution is working towards smarter and more effective use of our aid dollars. And so to join us for a discussion of these important issues, we're joined by two real experts on foreign aid who have provided over the years not only thought leadership on these issues, but also have served our country as practitioners in this field. Liz Schrayer is the founding executive director of the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition. USGLC, whose materials are also available outside, has done a huge amount of work on foreign aid, and so if you're not familiar with the USGLC, I certainly encourage you to become familiar with that organization, particularly on these aid issues. Prior to USGLC, Ms. Schrayer served for 11 years as National Political Director for APAC. And Ambassador Mark Green has recently joined USGLC as well as Senior Director. Prior to that, he was Managing Director at Malaria No More Policy Center. He served as U.S. Ambassador to Tanzania from 2007 to 2009 and represented the 8th District of Wisconsin here in the United States House of Representatives as well. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Liz.
Thank you, Rachel. It's great to be with FPI. I just think you and your colleagues are doing fabulous work. The allergies have caught me, so excuse my voice. But I'm really glad to talk to you. To start with, is it worth it? Often I bring some of you might have been the recipients of passing down from Hill office to Hill office. I see them when I travel to Hill offices. These little globes we once brought up here, and they are a globe of the world in their piggy bank. And then we put one, not real dollar, but real penny, but 1 penny. And so the question that we're going to talk about is that 1 penny of our federal dollar worth it, and what does it do, and what's the state of play here on Capitol Hill? And what we are advocates for is we believe the international affairs budget, that 1% of the federal budget, or 1 penny on a dollar, is absolutely critical to our national interests. And I'll share a few thoughts from me, and then Mark will certainly give you his view from inside. So first, just so you know who I represent, we're often known around this town as the Strange Bedfellow Coalition. As if you look from our material, it's a little strange of how the Chamber of Commerce and Walmart and Boeing and Lockheed and Save the Children and World Vision and APAC all come together. Over 400 NGOs and businesses come together in support of the international affairs budget. And typically, I bet a lot of you do not get seen by these type of groups coming into your office together. We're also really proud of our leadership voices. Our advisory council is led by General Colin Powell. It includes every living Secretary of State, from Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, Condi Rice, Madeleine Albright. We have a large group of former senators and congressmen who have joined us from both sides of the aisle. One of the most interesting groups that I've had the pleasure to work with is we have a National Security Advisory Council. 110 retired 3- and 4-star generals and admirals who have spent their entire career in the defense that are coming to Capitol Hill in support of the non-military tools of global engagement. I'll talk about why. And while we are activists in all 50 states, here's 2 examples of our chairs in Florida, Jeb Bush and Donna Shalala. And what you'll see, if you get to know us a little more, is very bipartisan support for this little 1%. Why? Why do we do it? When we started off, a lot of it was around this belief of we as Americans are moral leaders in the world, and first and foremost, it's about saving lives and making sure that people who really are suffering, whether it's a famine in Africa or extreme poverty throughout the world, what is our lending a hand. But more and more we have focused on at the USTLC about effective aid, about how to make sure that when we are providing whatever taxpayer dollar, we have to do it in a way that is making sure we're helping lift people, helping them lift themselves out of poverty. And I think some of the great programs were established particularly in the last administration, particularly the PEPFAR program, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which Mark serves on, and actually was a lead sponsor when he was here in the House, are critical examples of critical programs where we not only are saving lives, but we're really helping build economic growth. More and more we see, particularly when you look at some of the regions that are most troubling in the world, look at the Arab Spring, North Africa right now, and how important making sure that we are helping our allies, whether it be Israel or other allies throughout the world, that we make sure that as there's emerging democracies that could go either way right now, and again, we can talk about lots of places throughout the world, but I'm particularly focused on the Arab Spring countries, that how you make sure that we use our resources to help foster democracy and stability, I think, even as much as anything. One of our key messages that you'll find is we think this international affairs budget is absolutely critical to our national security. These are just a couple quotes from some of the real great leaders. David Petraeus has been one of the strongest, Secretary Bob Gates, Admiral Mullen, the Joint Chief of Staff, now Joint Chief of Staff Chair General Dempsey. Every military leader keeps saying, we cannot stay safe on our military alone. It's the tools of development, diplomacy, if used right, if coordinated right, that really can provide that stability. I don't know how many of you saw Charlie Wilson's War. I don't know if you saw it. If you haven't, go back and watch it. But the very, very last scene is the Russians are leaving Afghanistan. Charlie Wilson, former congressman, is up before a committee trying to get a few $100 million for education in Afghanistan, and he is not successful in convincing his colleagues that that is a useful investment. And as Tom Ridge, who was our first Homeland Security Secretary, often says, what if? What if we had invested in that prevention at that critical time? None of us will ever know. National security, these tools, if used right, are critical. More and more, one of the things that every member of Congress thinks about is about economic issues. How does anything we do affect jobs here back at home? And I don't think there's anything more critical for our conversations to not just focus on all the foreign policy that probably a lot of you deal with, but how do these issues affect us here? What we are finding in our business community, and we gave you a little pamphlet that really lays this out, when 95% of the world consumers live overseas, and 1 out of 5 jobs is connected to exports, we're the fastest growing markets. They're no longer our traditional partners. They're no longer some of the more traditional stable markets. Fastest growing markets of the world today are in the developing world. So how do we use tools to help make sure our businesses can grow and can compete? If you go to, have you been to Africa recently? A few of you? Well, what I've not been, what people have tell me over and over again, and Mark may address this, is you cannot turn your head without bumping into the Chinese, because they are all over Africa. And what is our country doing? What are the tools that we do to make sure that we're helping businesses? And more, we're helping make sure and encouraging the international affairs budget to be part of that tool. There are misperceptions about foreign assistance, there's no question. If you've probably seen these polls before. If you ask the American public, this is a 20-year poll, and it has never changed between these numbers within 4 or 5 points. How much do we spend on foreign aid? Your voters will say 25%. How much do you think we should spend? Again, these are averages over a 20-year period. About 10%. And as we're talking about, it's about 1%. So one of the challenges, and I think sometimes one of the things that policymakers get, is they're getting this negative reaction to foreign assistance because they think it's 25% of our budget. And we've done some work where you go in and do focus groups and you reset the reality and it's 1%. Well, that's about right. In fact, a lot of them think it should be much more. So it's 1%, and I think what's interesting to note, it's about 7% of our, what I would call the security funding. So when you think about how we spend overall in security, obviously the biggest one should and is the defense spending, but there's other tools in our kit, and that's why you see people like General Petraeus and others saying, we need a range of tools, and then we have to think about how do we use them to advance our national security. So here's a look at the international affairs budget over a period of time. And this is in real dollars as a percentage of GDP. And what you'll notice is the high water mark is Ronald Reagan in 1985. And you see this enormous drop down in the 90s. And if you think about that period of time, post-Cold War, pre-9/11, a relatively strong isolationist foreign policy in this country. And it starts to move up. It's a post-9/11 bump. That big bump that you're seeing in the 2000 is the Iraq surge in terms of the aid. But where does it come up? It comes up under President Bush, largely driven not only by our response to the frontline states in needs, but PEPFAR again, the fight against HIV/AIDS throughout the world, and the Millennium Challenge Corporation. Now, last year, important to note where we are now in the budget process. Obviously, you just had the budget vote yesterday in the House of Representatives. After the 2010 election, a lot changed around here, and we all know that, and there was a real focus and an uber focus on cutting spending and cutting government. And when you have no deals on some of the big issues, taxes and entitlement, where do you go to cut? There's only one place, discretionary funding. In the deal that was FY11 deal, so 2 fiscal year negotiations ago, there was an agreement to cut a large portion. Remember the winners from the 2010 election. There was a conversation about we're going to cut 100 million out of the federal government, and what ended up is it ended up being 38. Well, of that, 17% came out of the international affairs budget. 17% came out of 1%. The reason I share you with this is we don't come to Capitol Hill and say, cut everything else, but don't cut the international affairs budget. Like I say, we're not that foolish. But we do say, don't do it disproportionately. Because if you do it disproportionately, it is going to hurt our own national security issues. So the reason I share that with you is because it started cutting disproportionately. If you look at what happened last time around, the fiscal year that we're in now, these are just some of the numbers of percentage cuts that were happening in the House budget, House appropriations, Senate appropriations. And the final deal did, yet again, cut about 9% from FY11. So in the course of 2 fiscal years, where we're at the starting point, it's already a 15% cut in those 2 years, disproportionately, way disproportionately compared to the rest of the security function. So again, that's our concern. Our concern is around that. Now this year, the FY12, this is the final deal. These are the final numbers, $55 billion. And I think most of you know, but just to remind you, there's really 2 buckets to the international affairs budget right now. There is what we call base funding, what you call base funding, which is pre the war, frankly, would have been all we were talking about. But since the war, the Defense Department set up, as you know, an OCO account, an Overseas Contingency Operation, to pay for our frontline state war funding. Last year, the Obama administration created a civilian side to that OCO account. They used to spend money, but a lot of it sometimes was in supplementals, but now it was part of their presentation, accepted by the House of Representatives, accepted by the Senate, and so we now have these kind of 2 drivers of our international affairs budget, as well as our defense budget, a base and an OCO funding. We support both of them, and we supported the budget request out of the President this year. This is a little picture of a letter that after the President's budget went up on the international affairs budget, which was supported by over 80 of these military leaders. Again, when defense, as you know, is having its hard time up on Capitol Hill and the administration, these folks are up here saying, well, don't forget this little 1%. The numbers, and I'll kind of close with these last few slides, the numbers right now, just so you know, the first one is what is actually happening, almost $55 billion. That's this fiscal year we're in now. The request from the administration brought that up just a little bit, 2.4% with in the request. The budget that you passed yesterday in the House, for those of you from the House, is down 13% from that request and down about 11% from baseline. The last thing I show you is the following. this is just an interesting, we looked at this as saying, you know, where is our funding going if you supported just the president's request, because we don't have the details enough on the budget that was passed yesterday. So just playing off of, you can get a gauge. And not surprising, where is a big chunk, the Middle East, Africa, South Asia. And what I always point out to this is, especially some that are focusing on Latin America and South America, the Western Hemisphere, is one of the concerns of these deep and disproportionate cuts is that what happens is we can deal with the crisis of today. We can deal with the hotspots of today. But as you all know, as I assume largely foreign policy thinkers, there are so many unsettling places in the world. And I keep looking at some of those places in the Western Hemisphere where you think it's just tomorrow we're going to get back in, possibly with more cost, more expense in dollars, and the biggest cost of all. So I share with you just that perspective to think about your title of the program, is this worth the cost? Is we feel very passionately that this 1% is, if used right, and we spend a lot of time also on the effectiveness part, and both Mark and I are happy to talk about it, but is really critical. You know, I'd say certainly for our moral beliefs, we have a big part of our community that's part of the faith-based community. It is absolutely central to our national security. I don't think we've ever seen it more than what we're seeing play out throughout the world. But more and more, if we don't get in the game economically, it is going to make a difference down the line. And as my friend John Murphy from the Chamber of Commerce always says to me, without this international affairs budget and other tools, we are unilaterally disarming ourselves on the economic competitive field in the global marketplace. So I will leave you with that, and you'll hear more from my colleague, and look forward to talking with you.
Thanks, Liz. Actually, I was thinking as Liz was saying early on, reciting the Charlie Wilson story, the story I'm going to tell you is actually the opposite of that. Charlie Wilson's story is what could have been and what should have been. And I'm going to tell you a different story about what was. August 7th, 1998. Al-Qaeda struck simultaneously the embassies in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, and Nairobi, Kenya. 229 people were killed, about 5,000 people were injured. On that day, and with those simultaneous attacks, extremists, Al-Qaeda, sought to drive us out of Africa. Tanzania was, in a lot of ways, a very logical target for Al-Qaeda. Very heavy Middle Eastern influence in Tanzania. At that time, quite frankly, the government was sort of leftward-leaning. All the military officials had been trained in Bulgaria, and it was a one-party, largely socialist state. Not 10 years later, February 2008, the Tanzanian people welcomed the first ever official visit by a U.S. president. And it wasn't just a U.S. president, it was a very conservative U.S. president during a time of war. And as I stood there as ambassador with that president, we saw streets that were 10 deep with the Tanzanian people. In fact, they didn't even know the route we were going to take, going from the airport into town, and yet the crowds were gathering. The week before that visit, the Grand Mufti of Tanzania and the Grand Mufti of Zanzibar, the two highest-ranking Muslim officials in the country, wrote an open letter which was put in the newspapers saying, "George Bush, we welcome you here. Thank you for all you have done for our people." In less than 10 years, we went from extremists literally trying to drive us from a region to the closest working relationship in the region. What happened in between? In between, we saw, on a terrible day when the rubble was still smoking, immediately, the American people, through the officials of the embassy in Dar es Salaam, and the Tanzanian officials, forged a partnership to take on the very conditions that had contributed and created fertile ground for the extremists. One of the largest PEPFAR, one of the largest AIDS programs in the world is in Tanzania. President's Malaria Initiative, this is the second of the 3 first countries for the President's Malaria Initiative. The Millennium Challenge Corporation, the largest compact in the world, is in Tanzania. And more significant than the actual compact and the roads that it's helping to build was that it had provisions in it for the startup which took on the problems of corruption and excess bureaucracy. I have a lot of wonderful memories, a lot of images that run through my head from that presidential visit. But one of the most interesting ones was that on the second day, President Bush welcomed a group of Tanzanian soldiers who were going through training, and they posed for a photo, all of them together, in front of Air Force One. Those soldiers were being trained to be deployed as peacekeepers to Lebanon and to Darfur, essentially on our behalf. So again, less than 10 years, you go from a leftward-leaning country, a country that was considered to be fertile ground by extremists, to one of our great and close allies in the region. And I think that is a perfect illustration of what can be done. So, I'm a conservative Republican former member of Congress. Let me tell you why I support the International Affairs Budget. It's real simple. Number one, it keeps us safer. When you're a superpower, when you are a leader in the world, as we are, our leaders deserve all the tools of national security. Hard power and soft power alike. Because the challenges we face are complex, they're rapidly changing, they're diverse, and if we don't give our leaders all of the tools, we're doing a disservice to our people. Number two, it keeps America growing. When you talk to the major employers that all of you represent, I guarantee they will tell you that a large part of their projected, hopefully, employment growth is going to come from their ability to export. And as Liz said, and she is absolutely right, the growing markets are in places like Africa and in the Far East. And we do know that there are others who are competing for those same markets. And state-run enterprises have an inherent advantage. They don't need things like, rule of law. They don't need transparency. In fact, they don't want transparency in these emerging markets. Our businesses need those things. And if we can help through the modest sums of money that we're spending to plant those seeds and to build that foundation, my view is get out of the way and business will take off and we'll do just fine. And the third reason is it keeps us American. And this is who we are. This is a great, great country filled with good people who care about what goes on in the world. And yeah, it's true. We do get called upon to help in humanitarian crises. Always have, always will. It's who we are. It is who we are. So, it keeps us safer. It keeps us stronger economically. And again, as I like to put it, keeps us American. It is who we are.
Thank you to you both. I may just start off with a question or two, and then we'll certainly open it up for the last half of the program to questions from you all. Many observers of the foreign aid discussion have looked to President Bush's Millennium Challenge Corporation as an innovative solution to improving the effectiveness of our aid in terms of transparency and accountability. I wonder if you all could just provide us with an update of the MCC in recent years, where it stands in the Obama administration, and if it still offers a promising path forward.
Well, since Mark's on the board, he should answer.
And I'd be delighted to. Yeah, I'm a proud original co-author of the Millennium Challenge Corporation, and now proudly serve on the board of directors. And it's very interesting. in development circles, people talk a lot about the MCC effect. And it was this idea that you can actually incentivize reform in the developing world. In other words, where you have countries that are willing to take on their problems and commit themselves and be willing to be held accountable for good governance, investing in people, opening up markets, then we should incentivize that. More and more, I think there's a better MCC effect. A couple of days ago, there was a gathering of literally a lot of the people who helped to create it. And one of the things that they observed, and I think is really true, the moment the MCC was launched, and it was done so, it came from President Bush himself, but it passed with great bipartisan support, it immediately changed the debate and the discussion in the city. For the first time, people stopped talking about inputs, started talking about outputs, started talking about results. And the really remarkable thing is, I think it has changed every program in the development sector. So, I'm not going to tell you that all of our development programs are there yet, but I think there are reforms underway. I think there is more accountability being built into these programs as we speak. I think there is a greater effort to do monitoring and evaluation, and I think there's a greater effort for capacity building in the developing world, and to really devote ourselves to true partnerships, and the partnership being the U.S. You know, we're a blessed country and we have some resources, but on the other side having real accountability, commitments, agreeing to be measured. So I think the MCC, which is continuing to move along, although I will say, when MCC is flat funded as it has been, it can only do so many compacts, so it can't touch as many places in the world as I think many of us would like to. But I think this great bipartisan program is really helping to move the entire development apparatus towards greater reform and greater accountability. So, we are better than we were just a few years ago. We're not as good as we're going to be, but some real progress is being made. And final thought on that, I think it's important as the budget process moves along, you get to appropriations and there are things that, the tough choices that everyone has to make on what you're going to fund and what you're not going to fund and so on and so forth. I would just say that, we need to be careful not to weaken the capacity of programs and agencies to do some of these reforms. So, it's very important, if we're going to hold the development community accountable, which we should, we also need to give them the tools to be able to get to where we all want to see those organs and agencies go.
Rachel, if I could just add two other thoughts. I just want to underscore two things Mark said. The MCC effect is two ways, and one is the number of countries that are looking at how do they change the metrics that the MCC require in order for them to qualify. So you've got a whole set, 17, I think, different indicators that countries have to do of making sure they don't have corrupt government, making sure they have transparency. So there's this effect that, Mark, I just want to underscore, that's happening at the country level that was really the driver of MCC. But to give you a couple examples of the MCC effect that was not necessarily part of the plan but had this incredibly good impact is, let's take USAID and look at some of the reforms that have happened that are really important. So they now have took the monitoring evaluation that MCC had in place and retooled it so it fit a USAID model, created now what is being considered and talked about as the world standard in development world on monitoring and evaluation that others are doing it. I'm not going to tell you it's perfect. It's a long way from where it was, but then moved it to a transparency so that all of us can go online today and go to www.foreignaid or foreign assistance, I'm not sure, foreign assistance, and it's they call it the dashboard, and you can see any project that American taxpayer money is going to, and what they're guaranteeing is there will be 250 evaluations in year end that will be at a level unlike anything that we've ever done, and frankly a lot of other agencies in this government don't do. And the last thing that I think is part of this reform movement that's been really important is a change in procurement reform of how USAID is doing it. So I just wanted to underscore with a little more detail of this MCC effect, changes on the ground in countries, not everything we all want to see, but moving in the right direction, and changes not just in how MCC is doing work, but how we're seeing it at USAID. And Congressman Poe has a terrific bill in the House that calls on Congress to take the transparency and dashboard that USAID is doing and move it into all of our foreign assistance programs, and we certainly would love to see that move forward.
Yeah, I just want to say, this is, development is a wonderful area of government in that it's on a continuum. The progress that we've all seen is bipartisan. It's in every administration, every majority, every committee adds something to it. It's an area in which people should feel pretty good. Again, no one's going to tell you that we've arrived, but it is clearly making progress, and progress that we should all look at and say, yeah, no, it's moving in the right direction.
Our government faces a crisis of confidence across institutions, and certainly USAID is not immune. I'd be curious to see if their approval rating is below or above the U.S. Congress.
That assumes that they know what it is.
Good point, good point. I wonder if you could discuss the role of public-private partnerships, both in administering foreign aid and also in achieving the confidence of the American people in the value of our aid.
Maybe I start off, and I'm sure Mark will add. One of the most interesting changes in development over particularly the last, I'm going to say 5 years. It started about 10 years ago, but it's really changed. The business community used to be involved in development philanthropically. Corporate responsibility, social responsibility, you'd see their foundations give to help this school someplace around the world or help in some place. It's really changing. And what we're seeing is the Walmarts, the Nikes, the Starbucks, the GEs, I can go on and on of companies that are listed in our material who are investing in business models about how you invest in development, empowering women. There's huge programs throughout the world, especially in Africa, about companies that are investing in empowering women. And so what we're seeing is this sea change of business saying, hey, private sector has to get in the game to make sure that we are helping move up